My name is Amira Sims, and this brief teaching scenario will go over the elements of classical conditioning with a student who has difficulty and visits during office hours. Okay, so to begin, even though we're going to be focusing on the elements of classical conditioning, I want to make sure you're not confusing classical and operant conditioning. Okay, so with both classical and operant conditioning, we're talking about making associations, but with operant conditioning, you're making an association between what you did and the consequences of what you did. So in the example we have here on the slide, we're going to say this rat is in a Skinner box, and when he presses the lever, the food pellet comes out. So the rat is going to learn to associate his behavior, pressing the lever, with the consequences of the food coming out, which would be a primary positive reinforcer. And essentially, this rat is going to be more likely to press this lever again and again because of that association between pressing the lever and getting the food. Now, that's operant conditioning. What we mainly focused on that I think that you're having the most difficulty with is classical conditioning. With classical conditioning, you're making an association between two stimuli, and then the behavior changes as a result. So in the example that we talked about in class with little Albert associated the loud noise with the white rat, and then after a while, all he had to do was see the white rat and he became feared. Notice there were two stimuli, and then as a result, the behavior changed. So we're going to go over the elements of classical conditioning in a little bit more detail on the next slide. And we're going to start with Pavlov's classical experiment just to kind of make sure we're grounded. And then I'm going to give you a new example, and I'd like for you to identify the elements of classical conditioning. And when we talk about the elements of classical conditioning, we're talking about the UCS, the UCR, the NS, the CS, and the CR. So that's the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. So let's go to the next slide and unpack this. Okay, so now we're looking at the elements of classical conditioning, and as you can see from this image on the slide, we have a picture of a dog that is drooling because there's meat in its mouth. Okay, so the UCS is always going to elicit a UCR. Think of it like a math equation. The UCS elicits a UCR. You're going to keep those together. When you see a U, this is before learning has occurred. All right, so whether it's a stimulus or a response, a UCR and a UCR, a UCS and a UCR are both before learning has occurred. All right, the neutral stimulus is something that's neutral. It's neither positive nor negative. Think about when you put your car in neutral. You're not going anywhere. So in this image here, the dog hears the tuning fork and he's like, what's that? He doesn't have a response. And in order for classical conditioning to occur, you're going to need to take this neutral stimulus and pair it with the UCS. So when you see an S, think spark, okay? S stands for stimulus, and a stimulus is something that stimulates you, it sparks you. So a UCS is a before learning spark. So you're going to pair this neutral stimulus with this before learning spark, and you're going to pair these two items together a number of times, and then the neutral stimulus is going to transform and become a CS, a conditioned stimulus. Now, when you see CS, a CS will elicit a CR. So C stands for conditioned. So a learned spark will produce a learned reaction. When you see R, we're thinking of responses, okay, a reaction. So when you put it all together, your UCS will elicit a UCR. You take a neutral stimulus and pair it with the UCS, and it will become a CS, and then a CS will elicit a CR. Now, when we're thinking about classical conditioning, in order for this to occur, there's a couple of processes, two important things that have to occur. One is contiguity and the other is contingency. So basically, it matters whether or not your neutral stimulus is presented prior to the UCS or after. In order for classical conditioning to occur, you're going to have to present this neutral stimulus first and then the UCS. You also need to have them in close proximity. Okay, so if you present this neutral stimulus, the goal is to have the two items paired together. So like I said, they need to occur together and with relative frequency. All right, so we're going to go over a novel example, and I'd like for you to identify the elements of classical conditioning. Okay, so now I'm going to give you an example, and this is a true story. Several years ago, my ex-husband and I went to a restaurant called Bamboo, and this is a place that we visited frequently. They had really good food. Okay, it happened to be a Vietnamese restaurant. So we go one day, and I ordered a dish that was absolutely delightful as usual. He decided to try something new. Well, the dish that he decided to try out had noodles that were rather large, and it turns out these noodles were slimy. So as soon as he tasted the noodles, as soon as he put the noodles in his mouth, he had a gag reflex. Okay, now my food was good. We finished our date and we left. Thought this was inconsequential, but then a few days later I said, hey, you want to go to Bamboo? And as soon as I said Bamboo, he had the gag reflex. All right, this is a really good example of classical conditioning. It's actually a special type of classical conditioning called taste aversion. And you can see the definition here on the slide. Taste aversion conditioned taste aversion is a powerful form of classical conditioning that occurs when an organism learns to associate a specific food or drink with illness. And you can see how taste aversion can actually protect an organism from consuming a substance in the future because of that one experience they had. They would avoid it, so it could actually, save their life or protect them. Something else I want to mention is that even though we're talking about classical conditioning in terms of changing behaviors, this also hints at the physiological component of classical conditioning. So we know that everything that is psychological is simultaneously physiological. So even though we're talking about changing behavior, there's actually physical changes that are also going on. And there's been some researchers that have experimented with animals and shown that when you damage a certain part of the brain, the animal can no longer learn via classical conditioning. So with classical conditioning, the main points I want you to take away is that you're associating two stimuli together, and as a result, the behavior changes. In order for that association to actually take effect, you're going to need to make sure that the two items that are paired together in close proximity with relative frequency. And you're going to have to present the neutral stimulus first and then the UCS. You also need to ensure that the neutral stimulus is probably something that's different, unique, novel, unusual, right? And sometimes you're going to have to do many pairings in order to get the effect, in order for classical conditioning to occur. In other case, like the example I just shared, there's just one pairing and you're able to affect change. All right, I hope those examples helped, but we're out of time. If you need some more help, I have tons of videos that I can give you. And remember, I'm always just a phone call or an email away.